You know, they say that money can't buy happiness, but it can buy a script editor. So, if you can believe it, it's Christmas once again. A time where we put aside our differences, learn to love each other, gorge on ungodly amounts of sugar and fat, and blow about 10 months worth of our earnings on needless tat that'll end up on eBay before March. And, most importantly of all, it's Christmas movie season. Now, I have my staples, films I watch every Christmas without fail through a mixture of genuine love for them and a dire urge to recapture that warm, fuzzy feeling that came with Christmases past. But one genre of Christmas film that I've never really truly managed to wrap my head around is the pseudo-Christian Christmas movie market. It's a genre that kind of straddles the line between the devout religious Christmas films, think your nativity movies, films like A Wrestling Christmas Miracle, etc., ones that openly push that Christmas is God's time and have strong religious overtones, and Hallmark movies, as in films that are schmaltzy, cheesy, and usually deal with either a family trying to get through Christmas in one piece, in the beigest way possible, or it's a romance plot about a successful city girl going back to her hometown and bumping into two of her guy friends she had a crush on in high school who are now both ridiculously hot. One usually runs a successful business and the other works in a junkyard, and she's got to decide who's getting the mistletoe. Pseudo-Christian films pinch the DNA of a Hallmark film and combine it with religious undertones, with the aim of trying to stealth Jesus on you during the holiday season. And I can't think of a better example of this kind of filmmaking than A Christmas Tree Miracle. A film so weighed down by its own neoliberal Christian agenda, it forgets it actually has to be an engaging production in order to make me even care. So the film follows the George family. Mum and Dad are Julie and David, and they have 3 children, eldest son Nick, eldest daughter Natalie, and a little girl called Nina. The Georges are your typical white, middle-class, hard-working family. David works in estate development and makes enough money that he forbids Julie from working. There are those undertones. They live in a mansion, and Nick, Nina and Natalie never have to want for anything. They're also all self-centered little gits who can't see past their own enormous egos. They all think they're the main character in this film, and they all look down on everyone and anyone around them. And that includes the little girl Nina. Oh, don't get me wrong, the film wants you to think that she's an angel and precocious, but she's as self-centered as the rest of them. She just hides behind the fact that she's a kid as a shield to be a bit of an arsehole to people. And the neolib vibes I mentioned earlier stem from the fact that, while throughout the film they pay a lot of lip service to good causes, the reality is they don't give a tinker's fig about anyone, and they're only doing anything charitable because it makes them look good or benefits them directly. This is shown perfectly in the opening, when the family are reluctantly dragged to Nina's school to watch her perform a cello recital. Nina loves the cello, it's the only thing she really cares about. But her dad's distracted by trying to schmooze a senator who's seeking re-election to consider hiring his company to design some new projects on vacant lots. Her mum is more interested in trying to keep up appearances with the other mums after she accidentally forgets to bring any canned food to the food drive. Natalie hates everyone and didn't even want to be there, and Nick is too busy with his girlfriend Molly. So, in a huff, Nina walks on stage and announces that she doesn't feel like playing before heading off to the bathrooms. Her mum goes in to comfort her in the most uninterested, half-arsed way imaginable before bluntly telling her that no one really cares about whether she played the cello or not, and then leaving. This is played as a sincere moment in the movie, and then isn't elaborated on again. And it's here really that the main thrust of the movie begins, as while out grabbing a quick coffee order ahead of an important meeting with his boss, David gets held up when the barista has to go and try and shoo away a hobo-looking guy who introduces himself as Henry, who's just chilling in the cafe and doesn't really want to order anything. David has no fucks to give about Henry, he just wants his coffee, so he tells the barista to just make 2 of whatever David ordered and give 1 to Henry so he can stay. I should note, again, this isn't played with kindness. This is played with a "this asshole is holding me up and I'll pay $2 if it means I can get the hell out of here" vibe. Anyway, David makes it to his meeting with some exciting ideas and news, but David's boss is less than enthused because the company underperformed for that quarter and That, combined with an update from David's boss saying that the senator he's been schmoozing called to say the projects were all on hold indefinitely, means cuts are going to have to be made. And David's unfortunately being let go. David's clearly upset at first about the situation, but heads home, and after speaking to his wife, he decides it's no big deal and that they'll get through Christmas and then he'll start job hunting in the new year. At which point we get a flash montage of Christmas Day, in which Natalie gets a designer jacket, Nick gets a brand new car, and then Christmas is over. Yes, somewhat surprisingly, a film called A Christmas Tree Miracle actually only features Christmas Day collectively for 10 minutes of its hour and 43-minute runtime. The rest of the film takes place between February and early December the following year, with the last scene in the movie taking place 2 weeks before Christmas itself. Which is just such a bizarre thing to do for a Christmas movie. And it paints the filmmakers into a bit of a corner really, because they now have to make up creative reasons why locations will be decked for Christmas when it's September to November time. Anyway, David tells Julie that they're going to have to keep it a secret from the kids for the time being, and what follows is an extended montage running to a good third to a half of the movie's remaining runtime of the family slowly cutting back more and more. They sell their summer house, they cut back on after-school classes, they stop most direct debits. Eventually they resort to selling a lot of household items. The kids aren't really aware that anything's going on at this point, mainly because they're too wrapped up in their own world. All the while, David tries and fails to find any kind of work that suits his needs. Eventually, things come to a head when Julie winds up having dinner with her much begrudged sister Cindy, where she basically confesses that the family are in dire straits, and Cindy offers to buy Julie's share of the family inherited jewellery. Something she's very reluctant to do, but ultimately agrees to. David also swallows his pride and visits his dad looking for help. His dad, however, is less than welcoming and basically reminds David that when he needed help to keep his farm running, David purposefully dropped out of agricultural college, which his dad had paid for him to attend, and ran off with Julie, never to be heard from again outside of social media posts. David's dad basically tells him that he needs to stop looking for the jobs he wants and to start looking for jobs that work, before basically telling David that he can take all of his money if he wants, but unless he pulls himself up by his bootstraps and cuts his cloth to match his earnings, he'll just wind up back in the same situation a couple of months from now. David is furious about this and storms off because how dare someone tell him to try and live within his means and budget and look for a job with a salary rather than pinning everything on better paid jobs or nothing. Oh, and because it's relevant at this point, off-screen David also tells Julie that she's still not allowed to look for work, because he's the head of the household and that he'll save them. So, fuck this guy. Anyway, eventually a day of reckoning arrives when it's revealed that all of the family's cell phone plans have been disconnected, which finally makes the kids ask some questions. And this is where it all comes out. The family have no money left, they're going to have to cut back even further and basically sell everything they have, and if their luck doesn't change soon, they're going to lose the house. Nick seems to get the worst of this situation as his dad reveals that both him and Julie have spent his entire college trust fund, and they're going to have to take his car off him as, even though it was a Christmas present, they bought it on finance and can't afford to keep up with the payments. Naturally, Nick is furious, but then Natalie and Nina get equally upset, despite the fact that they didn't lose anything really as a result of their family running out of money. At which point, we see the tragic downfall of the family. Nick and Natalie are made to attend public school.
Oh, good lord!
And because Nick now no longer has a car or college tuition, his girlfriend Molly breaks up with him because he's just not sexy anymore. Natalie apparently just doesn't get to sit with the mean girls, mainly because she can't afford the fast fashion trends anymore. And Nina? Well, Nina's actually doing pretty okay. Eventually, the time comes and the family have to sell the house. They wind up living in a motel. Julie and Natalie go to a local church to get a food parcel, and while waiting in line, Natalie wanders off and we're introduced to Tessa, who is symptomatic of this film's issues, so more on her later. Anyway, after a couple of nights at the motel, the owner comes over to inform the family that their checks have bounced and that they have 20 minutes to pack up and leave. Distraught and uncertain about their futures, the family are lost, and so Nina, of all people, suggests that they throw themselves upon the mercy of the church. So, they all head over to the chapel. They spend the night, and in the morning they're rudely awoken by a guy delivering a Christmas tree. But this is no ordinary guy, this is Hobo Henry, the guy David forced a coffee on earlier in the movie. And after a long chat in which the family recount the entire movie up to this point and they help decorate the tree in the chapel, Henry invites the family back to his tree farm to chat and rest up. The gang oblige, and suddenly we're on a tree farm, and Henry reveals his past. Henry had a wife and daughter who both sadly passed away, but his wife's last wish was a simple one. She didn't want anyone who wanted to have a Christmas to go without. So she instructed Henry to use her family's vast wealth to construct a huge Christmas tree farm. And each year he was to give away as many trees as possible to families and organisations that needed them but couldn't afford them. And he has a proposition for the George family. He offers them food, pay, shelter, and an extended crash course on how to run and maintain a tree farm in exchange for as many of the family members that are able to work on the farm to work for him. Initially, they're not sure what to say, but eventually most of them accept. And so begins the family's humble living period. But old habits die hard, and as my old man used to say, once a cunt, always a cunt. He never said that. As the shady senator from the beginning of the film approaches David with a proposition involving Henry's tree farm, and the rest of the family somehow manage to take simple living and make it a grotesque pantomime of what it should be. In a finale that had me rising to sing the Internationale, will David sell his soul for the almighty dollar? Will Henry break last year's tree-giving record? And seriously, they did Tessa so dirty on this one. We have a lot to unpack here. Still, all this and more will be answered if you check out A Christmas Tree Miracle. And I think the thing that sticks in my craw the most about this film is that technically it's not awful, but morally it's horrendous. Like, if the film had looked like crap and had a bad message, this would have been an easy dunk and run job. But because, in my opinion at least, it's technically passable but morally unsound, it makes actually breaking down why it's bad a bit more difficult. For starters, and probably where the bulk of this review is going to spend its time, the script's horrendous. It really does feel like it needed at least another couple of passes to get it to a somewhat decent place. But even then, I think it would have struggled. On a technical level, in my opinion, it's poorly assembled. These kinds of films really should run for about an hour to an hour and a quarter to best position themselves to find their place in the market. Running to 60 to 75 minutes means that TV stations can do 2 to 3 ad breaks across the full runtime. It allows for a little bit of wiggle room for the station to edit the film to make it easier to fit into the schedules. It's a quick way to get an easier shot at distribution. This film's an hour and 43. It's at least 15 minutes longer than these kind of films should run for. And for me, it's almost 45 minutes longer than it needed to be. I mean, quite honestly, given how basic the plot actually is, this could have been a solid half-hour short film, and I still wouldn't have liked it, but it would have been significantly better than what it is. This film crawls at an hour and 43. I began to lose the will to live by the 30-minute mark because the vast majority of the runtime is dedicated to just watching the Georges lose everything. It really didn't need to be 50 plus minutes of the movie. So by the time Hobo Henry turns back up and starts setting up the stall for the third act, I had almost completely given up on the characters and the plot and was basically just watching for it to be done. The act structuring is really wonky too. The first act for this film runs to roughly 20 minutes. That gives you enough time to set up your key characters, establish their situation, and get to the part where the family start losing everything. There's then about 50 minutes that make up the second act where the family loses everything, and then 10 to 15 minutes for a very rushed, out of left field third act that tries to play itself as a win, but really wasn't a win. The tone of this film's way off too, like, I was racking my brains trying to think what this film reminded me of initially, and then I realised that the first act or so of this film Basically feels like a Dollar Tree version of The Middle, but without the fun or goofy plotlining. And then from around the midpoint of the second act to the end, it tries to do this whole family struggle but get redeemed arc that's played largely seriously but is punctuated by Hobo Henry, who's an absolute lunatic and gives off strong Daffy Duck having a manic episode vibes. I'm not exaggerating about that either. It's like someone introduced Willy Wonka to Threads. It's jarring, and even after a couple of days of musing it over, I still can't quite decide what tone this film was trying to capture, because it isn't funny, it isn't harrowing enough to be taken seriously, and it isn't heartwarming enough to leave me feeling all mushy and emotionally vulnerable. But easily, the biggest problem this film has is with its characters themselves, and more specifically the politics of this film. As I mentioned near the start of this review, this film has neoliberal politics running right through the heart of its agenda. Some would mistake this as a Republican-inspired film because there's plenty of talk of good people and good, honest work, but that's where the pseudo-Christian influence derails that. Because this film wants to try and appeal to the broadest number of people possible, they're being quite coy about putting Christianity at the heart of proceedings. Presumably because they're worried if they get too "my God is an awesome God," that people will be turned off. If this was a Republican-led film, they wouldn't care. But here, they do. Which means there's a lot of talk of faith, but not in a broad sense. You know exactly what faith they're referring to. They talk about the afterlife cryptically, but piecing together the various dribs and drabs from this film, it becomes clear that they're talking about Christian heaven. There are multiple times throughout the film where the family end up either at a church out of necessity or going to church to try and restore their faith and hope that an answer falls out of the sky for them. Which, in this film, it does. But Dan, you may be asking, neoliberal politics and Christianity aren't synonymous. The two can exist as separate entities. Well, you're absolutely correct. But I felt the need to establish the Christian influence this film has here because that's a key aspect of why this film's ultimately aligned with neoliberal politics. Our characters are painfully middle class, they're desperate to keep up appearances. There's clearly some kind of religious influence on the family, with the dad being a patriarchal figure who won't allow his wife to work. They don't believe in handouts unless they need handouts. They aren't fiscally responsible, but they do like to give the illusion of fiscal responsibility. They just play their current circumstances as a run of bad luck. But the biggest tell that this is a neo-lib film is the sheer amount of lip service given to good causes in this, where our families say they support and are in favour of doing the right thing, but then act like utter arseholes about it when the time comes to actually get involved. There are multiple examples of this across the runtime, but they are a little spoilerific. But then, I'm not recommending this film, so if you don't want the film spoiling, just skip to the next chapter from here, please. Right off the bat, Julie promises to support the food drive at the local school, but then when the time comes, she doesn't. She apologises, but she doesn't even try to make amends for it. David only buys Henry a coffee in the coffee shop to get the barista to take his order quicker. He didn't give a fuck about the guy otherwise. Nick full-on abuses his mum and dad for spending his trust fund, even though it wasn't his money anyway. He also gives a random kid who's being bullied his phone when the bullies smash the victim's one, but that only happens after Nick's cell phone plan gets cancelled, so it was useless to him anyway. It's mentioned that Julie's mum passed away a while ago, but when she was suffering, Julie's sister, who's a full-time journalist, and her husband, who also works full-time, had to take her in and care for her until she passed away. While Julie, who's forbidden from working by her husband, did fuck all and only turned up after she died to collect her inheritance. Then there's Natalie, who's massively into fast fashion, who demands new clothes every other day and when she gets them, kicks off because they're not right. In fact, Natalie is probably responsible for the second worst thing that this family do in the film's runtime, and this is why we need to talk about Tessa. So, there's a scene where Julie and Natalie go to a church to try and get a food parcel. Natalie splits off from the line to go and check her emails on the church's computers and runs into Tessa, who's a bit odd, but not without good reason. So, Tessa and her mum are currently living in a homeless shelter and have been for the past 6 months because the house burnt down with all of their possessions in, barring what they were wearing at the time. They lost everything. and are basically reliant on the church or they'd be on the street. The type of character they're trying to go for with Tessa is a traumatised teen who's trying to mask with dark humour. But because of the Christian influence, they're worried about going too dark with the humour, which means Tessa, for lack of a better word, is just odd. Trying to be likeable enough that it makes sense in the film world for Natalie to be won over, but not so dark-humoured that the more sensibility-led crowd would be put off by a macabre. It leads to bizarre moments like this.
Oh, stop crying.
I can't!
Okay, how about I tell you a joke? Knock, knock.
Who's there?
Why are you asking me? I don't have a door. I'm homeless.
Anyway, the reason I bring her up is because Natalie sort of makes friends with Tessa. At first, she thinks she's weird, but because the script wants them to be friends despite the obvious incompatibility, they become friends. Tessa then disappears from the movie until about 15 to 20 minutes off the end, which is another problem. Why introduce a character, establish that she's going to be friends with one of the main characters, and then have her abandon the film for 40 minutes before coming back for literally a 2-minute scene near the end? Because that's what happens. When the family agree to work for Henry and move to the farmhouse, Tessa turns up claiming that she took several buses and an Amish buggy to get to the farmhouse to see Natalie, which, by the way, Henry has a car and knew that Tessa was coming. Just saying. Natalie is now delighted that Tessa's turned up as their busy mates, despite the fact that the pair have only ever met once and haven't spoken to each other since then. The pair then disappear off into the house to talk about making dresses because Natalie has picked up fashion design while living at Henry's. Anyway, why is Tessa an important character? Because of how the film ends. So at the end of the movie, Henry passes away in a very sudden and without good cause way. They basically throw something out about how Henry had a heart defect and that he knew he didn't have long, so he wanted to find the right people to take on his tree charity, and by the right people, the film seemingly means that one asshole who gave me a coffee 1.5 years ago. Because just for doing that small act, Henry went and changed his will to leave the entire estate to the Georges. Another reason why this scenario is fucked is because David was secretly working with the senator from earlier in the film to try and covertly sell Henry's house and land via a legal loophole, so that they could demolish the tree farm and build a warehouse on the land. And even after Henry dies, David is still pretty set on doing that, bearing in mind that almost the entire third act has consisted of nothing but Henry rambling on about how it was his dead wife and daughter's final wish for this land to be a tree farm that helped the community, and how Henry also wanted this to be the case long after he'd passed. In fact, the only thing that stops David from going through with the deal, and what ultimately saves the day, is that the senator invites a senior government figure over to the farm to see what's going on, where it's revealed that the senior guy kinda knows Nina, because 12 months prior, David had sent out a shit ton of corporate cards with Nina on the front holding a cello, and that card had landed on the guy's desk the day his wife died, and he'd assumed it was out of condolences, despite the fact that David literally signed it in a can't-be-arsed, rushed kind of a way at the beginning of the film. At which point Nina offers to give the family and the senator a cello recital. She does, and then the senior government guy decides he doesn't want to buy the land anymore. And the senator ends up embroiled in a corruption scandal. Like, if that hadn't happened, David would have gleefully handed over Henry's life work, and given what I know about the guy, he probably would have done it for free. How does this impact Tessa, you might be asking? Well, because her and her mum are never seen from, heard from, or mentioned again. Bearing in mind, the Georges just inherited not only Henry's 3-story farmhouse, a 2-story barn, and a couple of hundreds of acres of land, but Henry's entire life savings, which also consisted of his loaded wife's entire life savings. They literally inherited significantly more money than they had when they started the movie. And they had more than enough space to literally build a completely new 2 to 3 story house on the land to house Tessa and her mum, alongside anyone else that they'd met on their travels who needed the help. And not only did they not do that, They don't even mention either of them again. They likely died in that homeless shelter without a cookie to split between them, and seemingly, the Georges didn't give a shit. This family were a bunch of arseholes. They were arseholes when they started the movie, and through sheer luck and bad judgment choices on behalf of the people around them, they ended up as lucky arseholes by the end of the movie. It's a nauseating experience, honestly. This is the thoughts and prayers of Christmas movies, with terrible moral alignment, really stale and poor dialogue, bad pacing, indecisive tonal choices, horrible characters, and a runtime that made me wish for brain death. I did not care for this script. I did not care for it one bit. The script was written by TYTD. He has 6 writing credits, with 2 titles in active production. His last credit was in 2020, but there isn't really anything particularly of note, and the credits are all kind of spread out. The film was directed by J.W. Myers. He has 3 directing credits. This film's the middle film of the 3, and his last credit was for a TV movie released in 2016. I tried to find some more information about JW because his IMDb was a little empty on trivia, and after some digging, the best I could find that was in 2018, he updated his LinkedIn to include that he started manufacturing his own line of NFTs, which really doesn't help this film's case, truthfully. On the direction front, there really isn't all that much to say, truthfully. It's technically on the level, but rather beige in my opinion. Like, in terms of beginner's guides rules on how to shoot a feature, that's about the level we're at here. I feel like all the different aspects of the production, lighting, camera, sound, were briefed on what needed to be set up, but no further discussions were had beyond do this. There's a distinct lack of creative zeal, that spark, the mark of a director's careful hand. The most creative directorial choice in this feature is opening the film with a shot from the midpoint of the film in black and white, insinuating that the film we're about to watch is a flashback. Otherwise, it's just a pretty linear, slightly dull-looking movie that, in my opinion, doesn't rise above middle of the road in terms of its execution. It's a bit of a similar story for the direction of the cast, too. I get the sense that careful discussions on how scenes were supposed to play out were had, but that deeper one-on-one conversation with the cast about how to deliver their lines and their motivations were distinctly absent. As such, while scenes do play out pretty much by the book in terms of basic execution, there's a distinct lack of anything extra. The cast seem uneasy on how to deliver the lines more often than not. There's minimal prop use, and what prop use is had is self-contained to specific scenes within the narrative, which comes across as quite restrictive. More often than not, it's 1 to 3 cast members stood or sat at near equal distances apart from each other, getting through their lines cleanly but with a slight falter before trying to hit their marks as closely as possible. It's imperfect. I've definitely seen worse, but this isn't great. As for the cine, well, like the direction, it's just about right, but nothing more. It really does feel like this was the first time out for the crew on this one, because while composition is fine enough, it's a little too fine enough. As in, it feels like whoever crafted the scene structuring read cover to cover a few film theory books and then just stuck rigidly to their advice on how to compose sequences. As such, what's here looks okay, maybe a little cheap in places, but the budget can't be helped with things like this. It's just missing that spark, that special magic that a creative eye can bring to shots. Cutaways and B-roll are minimal and feel absent, which would have really helped bring it up to the next level. As a result, the sequences look fine, but they don't really ever hit great, or even really good. As for the edit, while the sequences themselves are okay, the real sticking point here is simply just how long the end product is. I don't know if the editor spoke up during the post-production process to mention that the film was overrunning and felt bloated, or if they just cut the film in line with the script and the director and producer overruled any deviations, but it's way too long. As mentioned, this realistically shouldn't have broke 80 minutes, and ideally it would have been a 30 to 45 minute short. As it stands, it drags out the suffering of the Georges way too much, and while the sequences and scene structuring shows a level of competence, it doesn't mean a dot if I can't physically make it to the end of the film without wanting to rip the film out of my player and toss it into the nearest tar pit. Performance-wise, it's a little stiff and stilted. Probably the strongest performers in this are Claudia Esposito as Julia George, who manages to give a fairly strong down-to-earth performance. I wouldn't say it blew me away, but given some of the quality of the performances here, she nails natural fairly well. Terry Kaiser as Henry Banks, the Christmas tree hobo, is animate, eccentric, and totally out of place for this movie. But he still gives a decent turn with his performance because even if his character type isn't suited to the film, you better believe he tries to make the most of the situation. Jill Teague as Tessa is frankly bizarre, probably one of my favourite weird performances of the year. I can't say it's good, but I can say I was entertained. As for the rest of the cast, it's a bit awkward and overly theatrical. Kevin Sizemore as David and Emily Capehart as Natalie are both simultaneously stiff in their deliveries while thinking that saying the lines loudly equals drama. And Barrett Carnahan is a little too intense here as Nick. What should be a clearly frustrated teenager portrayal quickly winds up in manifesto territory when he has his car taken back. The supporting cast too really struggle to rise above awkwardly getting the lines out. It's a real shame, honestly. And finally, the soundtrack. It's stock music. Fine enough quality stock music, but stock nonetheless. Another string to it's a pseudo-Christian film that subliminally wants you to know it's a Christian film bow is that some of the stock music here is basically just MIDI recompositions of famous hymns. For example, one of the closing tracks of the movie is a MIDI orchestral slowdown of Lord of the Dance. Like I say, it's not bad scoring, but it only further robs this film of any kind of unique identity that it could have ultimately had. A Christmas Tree Miracle was released on DVD in the UK in 2014 by High Flyer Films. Its only press reviews were done by the Dove Foundation, so those pesky Christians are still up to it. In the US, it got a solo DVD release, and because it's called A Christmas Tree Miracle, it was also bundled together with another Dove Foundation lovey and Christmas stink bomb, A Wrestling Christmas Miracle. No solid extras on the set either, just the film, a trailer and a scene select, and that's about it. It hasn't had a Blu-ray release. It is available on Amazon Prime Video at the time of recording, but honestly, for the same price you might as well grab the DVD if you were going to grab this. I've no idea why you would though. A Christmas Tree Miracle would have been an unremarkable film had it not been for its mean-spirited script. While the visuals, performances and soundtracks are all just about on the level, the script goes so far out of its way to create so many dislikable characters, which it then tries to gaslight us into thinking are actually good characters, that it creates an unusual watching experience. For most of the runtime, I was actually just kind of bemused at the idea that someone watched this and thought that it was heartfelt. It really isn't. Definitely not recommended. If you know someone you don't like this Christmas, buy them A Christmas Tree Miracle.